Hello, welcome all. Today I'm here with the explanation of a new chapter, chapter first, the portrait of a lady written by Ch-1, and this is from your book Hornbill. So let's begin it. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. So, here the author speaks of his grandmother, and he says his grandmother looked the same way like everybody else's grandmother. She had been old and wrinkled as the grandparents look. They always look old and wrinkled with gray hair, and also she looked the same way. But what is interestingly said here that she looked the same way ever since his birth, ever since Otter's birth. That is, he was 20 years old now, and he had found his grandmother the same way for the last 20 years. There had been not a single change, not even a fraction of change in her appearance. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. And people say that she had once been very pretty and that she even had a husband, which was very difficult, or which is very difficult to believe, very hard to believe. Why? Because for the last 20 years, the author had been getting her the same way. There had been not even a minor change in her appearance. So, going by her appearance, the way she had been looking for the last 20 years, it was impossible for the author to imagine grandmother in some other ways. For him, grandmother looked the same way right from her birth. It was his imagination. He could not believe that she could look anything different from what she looked now. And that she had a husband, which was almost utterly impossible to believe. That she could ever have a husband was impossible to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Now, since it is said that she had a husband, so the author speaks of her husband, and what is said here, he says that his grandfather's portrait, that is picture, hung above mantelpiece. That is, his picture was there above, hung above the mantelpiece. That is, in the drawing room, say, in their drawing room, there was the mantelpiece. Mantelpiece means a place where people make fire, and which remains connected to a chimney, and the smoke is released through a chimney. So that mantelpiece, above that mantelpiece was grandfather's picture in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. So in the picture, grandfather appeared in loose-fitting clothes. In the picture, he wore loose-fitting clothes, and he had a big turban. He wore a big turban. So the author describes grandfather's appearance as he looked there in the picture. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. And there in the picture, uh, he had long beard, long white beard, and the beard covered the most part of his chest. That is, he had a long beard, pretty long beard. And he looked 100 years old. Even grandfather looked terribly old, so old that the author imagined him to be something around 100 years, looking or by the picture. Okay, then he did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. And going by the picture again, he looked as if he could only have grandchildren and he could never have children because he looked terribly old. And for such a man, it is very difficult to imagine that the person will have children. People can only imagine, for them, people can only imagine and say that they have lots, and they speak of them as having lots and lots of grandchildren. And he too looked as if he was having lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. And to imagine, to think of grandmother being young and pretty was revolting. That idea was revolting. That was something mind-boggling, something that gives you a wild imagination. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. Now, this grandmother often used to tell children of the kind of game she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. And it was again very difficult to imagine her playing the kind of games that she said she used to play. Because to imagine grandmother playing such game was quite absurd, quite rubbish, and undignified, below her dignity. Because she was now having grandchildren, and it was for the grandchildren to play such games, and to imagine that the grandmother played such kind of games was that a grandmother could play such kind of game was beyond her dignity, cannot be imagined. And so the children treated it something like the prophets, something like the fables of the prophets. She used to tell us it's something like the fables, stories of prophets, that she was telling stories of the prophets, that the prophets used to play this and that, and so on. So they could not imagine her as being their grandmother and playing such kind of games, but they treated her as part of a fable in which the prophet used to say do different kind of activities. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. About grandmother's appearance, she had always been short. She was short in height, a short statured, fat, and slightly bent. She was a little bent forward. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere, and there were wrinkles all over the face, and there were running from the crisscross, that is the lines, the marks on the face ran from everywhere to everywhere, that is everywhere on the face there were crisscross marks. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her, and they could only imagine her as being always old, and they could not imagine her being something different. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So, talking about grandmother, she was old. As previously mentioned, she was old, but not only old, she was terribly old. So old that she couldn't have grown older. She could not become older than that. She had reached the saturation point of point not in age but in her appearance, and so she could not grow older. She could not look any older than that, and she remained the same for 20 years. For 20 years she looked exactly the same way. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Okay, so, and what is said here that, well, looking at her appearance, one could not imagine that she could ever be pretty, ever be beautiful, good looking. That was impossible to imagine because the author found her the same, looking the same way for all 20 years that he had known his grandmother, the same way. So she couldn't have grown older, she couldn't have been even pretty, beautiful, but she was beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Now, talking more about the grandmother, the author says here, she walked about the house, hobbled, not steady, you can say, not steady movement. She hobbled, she wobbled. So she could not move steadily. First, secondly, she moved about in spotless white. That is, she wore white sari, and since she was pretty in her young days, that is, she was fair looking, so already the complexion was fair, and secondly, she wore white sari, so she looked completely white. She was in white and she looked spotless white, just white, fully white from top to bottom. And she moved in that white sari all over the places. That is, she moved inside the house, she moved about the house in her that appearance, white, spotless white appearance, and she hobbled. She moved in unsteady way, resting one of the hands on her waist. While she moved, she had one hand on her waist and other telling the beads of the rosary. That is, in the other hand, she always carried some kind of, you can say, the rudraksh, that is the beads of rudraksh made into a chain, a circle, a chain, and you find some people reading or say telling those beads So she used to do that. She used to do the same. So one hand would be busy telling the beads of the rosary, and the other hand would be on her waist balancing, getting her proper balance, helping her maintaining the proper balance of the body. As previously mentioned, she was a little bent. She bent a little bent forward. So she had to balance the body, and to balance the body, she had to take the help of her hand, other hand, and with the other hand, she used to give the body a little balance. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and again her hair were all silvery, all grey. As they were grey, so they looked silvery. So here the author mentions here silvery lock, referring to the grey hair of the grandmother. And at the same time, she had the puckered face. Puckered means face having folds. Skin folding on face, that is called puckered face. So her face was puckered, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer as she kept herself busy telling the beads of the rosary. So her lips also remained engaged in her prayer. She was always busy in her prayer, remembering the God, or praying to God. So that was it, and the prayer was always inaudible. That is silent. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains. Yes, she was beautiful, and she was just like the winter landscape in the mountain. So during winter time in the mountains, what do we see, or what we find? Snow. The mountain gets covered with snow, so she just looked the same way, complete white. An expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. So she was an expanse of pure white serenity. She was fully white. Fully white, so an expanse, a spread of pure white serenity, beauty, breathing peace and contentment. And she was always breathing peace. That is, she was at peace. There was peace in her life, and she was contented. She had no desires. She was free from desires, so she had a peaceful life, peaceful living. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. So the author talks here about the situation which allowed him to stay with grandmother. So it all happened that our father worked in the city, and he had to stay there. And since he had to take his family there, so first he went with his wife, that is author's mother, and first they made all the arrangements there. And when they got settled there, after that he called. He sent for both of them. So until they were settled there in the city, he was left there with the grandmother in the village. So both of them stayed together for that amount of time until they were called to the city. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. In the morning, she would wake him up and also get him ready for the school. That was the duty of grandmother, since there was no third person in the family there in the village. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed me, dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. So she had a routine, daily routine, that is, in the morning she had to give Otha a bath, she had to dress him up for school, get him ready for the school. So until he got ready, that is, while she get him ready, she would constantly say her prayers, and this time it would be a little louder. Sing-song way means in the way that in a little soft voice she would sing the prayer with the hope that the author would listen them closely and would learn them by heart. So with this hope, with this intention, she would sing the prayers to him. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. The author loved Granny's voice. Possibly she had a good voice and he loved her voice, and that's why he listened to her prayers but was not bothered, was not uh, at all at all careful, not at all, he didn't at all care to learn the prayers by heart. Then she would fetch me wooden slate which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen. Okay, after that, after getting him ready, she would also get other things ready, that is, the material, reading material, writing material ready. So, first of all, she would get him the slate, which would be plastered with yellow chalk, that is, yellow chalk would be applied. She would apply yellow chalk on the slate, and then she would also arrange for the ink in earthen pot, a small earthen pot, and then she'd also arrange for him a red pen and tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. And then after arranging all things, she would tie them into a bundle. She would wrap everything, all of them, all the materials together in a bundle, into a bundle. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar sprayed on it, we went to school. And then he would get his breakfast, the same breakfast every morning, that is thick stale chapatis, thick, not thin, thick stale chapatis, the chapatis that would be made the last night, that she made the last night, and on that she would spread some sugar and also butter, and that was his morning breakfast. And then they went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs, and at the same time she cared to carry chapatis, the stale chapatis, along with her for the village dogs. So this, my grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. So the author started living with grandmother because both the parents went to city because father had job there and mother went with father for some kind of settlement there. They wanted to settle there in the city. So he was left here until they got settled over there. And that's why he was there with grandmother. And grandmother always went to school with the author because the school was attached to a temple there. That is, school and temple were at the same place. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. So there, they were given two tasks. That is, they were given two lessons. One, the lesson on alphabet, and second, they were given the lesson on the prayer. Every day morning prayer was held there, and they were given the lesson on morning prayers. While the children sat in the rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scripture. So there the children sat in rows on either side of veranda, that is on the both side of veranda. So they sat there, they sang prayers, either they sang prayers or the alphabet in chorus together. Together they recited either the prayer, say they sang the prayer, or in the other case they recited the alphabet. But grandmother sat inside the temple, since all the children studied there, and so she sat inside the temple, and there she read the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together, and when they had finished their lessons for the day, both of them would start back home from there. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door, and while they would be returning home from school, or say from the temple, or they would be say accompanied by the dogs. Dogs would be waiting outside the temple every morning, and when their lessons were over, these dogs would also follow these two from behind. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. Now they would be following back to their home. These dogs would start following them from the temple door to their house, and on the way they would be given chapatis, stale chapatis that the granny would carry every morning. And while they would throw, or they would growl, that is, they would have aggressive posture towards the other dogs, because they would be say fighting for the chapatis. So they would be growling, that is, aggressively barking or shouting or taking aggressive posture against the other dog, and in this way fighting also sometimes with each other. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us, and when they were fully settled there, they sent for both of them. That is, they called both of them to join the family there in the city. That was a turning point in our relationship, and that was the point where the relationship took a different turn. Here they were very much friendly, but there it took a different turn. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. Like here too, they shared the same room. They were given a common room where both of them lived. So the thing is, though both of them shared the same room, but the thing here is that she did not accompany him to school. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus, and the question is, why didn't she accompany him to school? Why didn't she go to his school? It's because he read here in the city. He went to an English medium school, and there school bus service was there, and school bus used to come and pick him from the place. That is, the bus service was there. He was picked and dropped at the same place. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. And since she didn't go to school, or she didn't come out of the house, so the dogs. She had no chance getting the dogs, meeting the dogs, or finding the dogs and carrying them food. And that's why she made some changes in her routine, in her schedule. Not that way, but a little bit change was made here. And now she used to feed the sparrows in the courtyard only. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. So, as the years passed by, they saw less of each other. That is, there was a little time to spend together for both of them, because he was now in a school, he was young, and so he remained busy with his studies. Though Granny continued to wake him up and get him ready for school, yet there was not much of interaction between the two. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me, and when he returned from school, she would ask him what the teacher taught him that day. I'll tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. So, here at the city, when the author would return home from school, Granny would ask him about the lessons that he learned in school, and there he would inform her about the English words, Western style of education, that is, Western system of education, in which there were taught science, maths, history, geography. So he would tell everything about those things. Say the principle, like Archimedes' principle, law of gravity, and the world being round, etc., etc. He would say all about these things. This made her unhappy. She could not help me with my lessons, and that made her upset, her unhappy, because here she could not help him in his studies, in his lessons. So, because here the case is that she never studied all those things, she never studied English, so she could not help him in his studies, and that's why she was upset. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. Well, she didn't believe in the Western system of education, and she was particularly upset, distressed, because in these English medium schools there were no teaching about God, there was no teaching about the scriptures. No scriptures were part of their education, and that's why she was very much upset. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed, and one day she was informed by the author that they were being given, that the music lessons have started in their school, and that they are given say the lessons on music. So that upsets the granny. She was disturbed. To have music had lewd associations. It was the monopoly of the harlots and the beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. Okay, so, according to Granny, music was not for the gentlemen, was not for the good families. It was for the beggars and for the people of the dark world. Say for the for that word, prostitutes and all. She said nothing but her silence meant disapproval, and she rarely talked to me after that, and she did not speak a word there in front of the author, but she remained silent, and her silence meant her disapproval, that she did not support such kind of education, such kind of learning. And after that day, she hardly spoke to the author. When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. He cleared college, now he joined university, and there, for his preparation for his studies, he was provided a separate room, and this is where the granny became completely alone. The common link of friendship was snapped, the common link between the two, between the granny and the grandson, between the granny and the author was snapped, was broken. That friendship came to an end. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She accepted the seclusion, that she was segregated, that she was left alone, and that the author was given another room, separate room for his studies, and there was nobody with whom she could share her feelings, her thoughts. That was accepted by Granny readily, because she knew that he needed separate room for studies, and that he had already moved away from her life. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone, and now she kept herself busy with spinning wheel, the one that was spun by Gandhiji for weaving or for spinning yarn. So she kept herself busy with that spinning wheel. And reciting, sorry, spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayer from the entire day. She had no other work. She kept herself busy with two things. One, spinning a wheel with the spinning wheel, spinning the yarn, and secondly, with her prayers. These were the two things that she did throughout the day. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows, and between these two things there was a break that was taken by her during the afternoons, and during this period she would feed sparrows. While she sat in the veranda breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. And here, while she would break the breads into little pieces, tiny pieces, she would crumble the bread into tiny pieces, into bits. The sparrows would create a loud kind of noise. They would create ruckus there. They would create chaos there with their chirpings, with their chirpings. And then what they would do, these birds would collect round the granny. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head. These birds would be moving round Granny, and sometimes, on occasions, they would sit on her legs, on her shoulder, and even on her head. She smiled, but never shooed them away. She smiled, she gave only a smile to these birds, but never shooed them away, but never turn them away, never scared them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her, and that used to be the best half hour of her day.